Welcome to installation number 20 in our series, Worlds of Speculative Fiction. Small group tonight, all of us old regulars, and we're going to talk about William Gibson, so I don't have to do any introductions. We can just jump right in. I don't have to explain how we do things. This is excellent. I do have the literary and biographical timeline. I thought we could talk about that. I have a number of philosophical themes, and I'm sure you guys will have some other themes that you bring up as well. And then I found a number of interesting passages from mostly interviews, but also from a blog post that he did at one time. So, Gibson, with him, we're entering into, just like we did last time with Lovecraft, going into horror, we're entering into a different genre within speculative fiction, that of cyberpunk. Although, if we want to just call it sci-fi, I guess we could call it that as well. But it really was its own thing for a while, and now there's all these other like sort of split off genres like diesel punk and that punk, and I think one of the things that's the most remarkable that I wanted to start out with, and you see this in some of these passages, is Gibson himself was not a techie guy. At the time that he wrote Cyberpunk, at the time he wrote Neuromancer and these earlier stories like Burning Chrome and Johnny Mnemonic, he was typing on a typewriter, not even an electric typewriter, and he didn't have access to the internet until fairly late. He willingly concedes that when it comes to the contemporary internet, he got some things totally wrong. He didn't predict certain technologies. He's totally upfront about that. He doesn't get an email address until 1996 for a guy who's writing about the net and all that. And he tells us, well, how did you actually know about what was going on? He said, well, these other people were talking about these things, and I could overhear the conversations because the other people that I was hanging out with. So it's fascinating that he's able to become the author, known for this stuff. It'd be sort of like. He was really into music, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It'd be sort of like if somebody was going to talk about the history of heavy metal, and they'd only listened to classical music their entire life. But they'd heard distant conversations and imagined what heavy metal must be like.
Eavesdropped their way to expertise.
Yeah. So he's a really fascinating character. Let's actually start with one of these things. So this is from the heavy metal interview. In Heavy Metal magazine, which was part of the zeitgeist at the time, and they're asking him about his influences, and he says, "Well, I credit Starship Troopers for saving me from Vietnam because my reaction at age 14 was this sucks. I read Naked Lunch pretty early, around 16. I got bored with mainstream sci-fi pretty fast." Interesting for somebody who's going to be a sci-fi writer. Of the writers I loved at, say, 15, Fritz Leiber is the one who held up the best, and the more I learn of his life, the more I respect him for what he's done. I get a lot more in the way of direct inspiration from rock music. He devoted a lot of attention to punk bands and expanding his record collection. He says, I don't read much sci-fi. I haven't read much sci-fi in over 20 years. There's so much other great stuff to read. Now I read to gather material and momentum for my own work, and I just don't get that from sci-fi. Philip K. Dick, oddly, has had almost no influence on my work. Now, why would that come up? I think in part because Dick was hot at the time, and I think a lot of people saw connections between Gibson and Dick. And he says, a strange fact and one I can't explain, except the combination of acid and gravity's rainbow had something to do with it. I dug the whole punk thing from the start, or from when I was first aware of it, 1977. I felt kind of embarrassed because I remember those dorky 30-year-olds who'd come sleazing around the scene in 1968, because he was part of both the hippie and music and drug scene in the 60s. But the iconography of it was just sheer beauty to me, like Genet and Burroughs rolled into one shit-shot semiotic spitball. Nice little alliteration there at the end. And what you can see in that is he's really not, he's kind of an outsider. He's not somebody who decided that he was going to break into the field. There is, I guess you could say, some references and homage back to other thinkers or writers, but very often they're not sci-fi writers, right? The beat poets, for example. And if we look at his timeline, and his biography, we'll come back to this stuff. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. He's born in the South, in 1948, so he's essentially a boomer. Right at the early end of that, he gets moved around a bit, because of his dad's work. But his dad dies pretty young, and he dies in a way that's sort of prosaic, choking to death at a restaurant, on a business trip. And Gibson really hated where he was living. He did not flourish in the South. He writes about being kind of a gawky kid. The areas that he lived in were obsessed with basketball. I suppose sort of like living in Indiana in certain respects, where people really take that seriously, or other parts of the South where they take football super seriously.
Any sports.
Yeah. Sporting, we're going to sport some sports. And so he was kind of a loner, So eventually his mother thinks she's going to punish him by sending him off to boarding school. And he's like, sounds great to me. Send me off. And he goes to Tucson, which, was probably not really booming at the time, but certainly was more than what they had going on down there. Eventually his mother is going to die when he's about 18. He's not going to finish school. And then he starts traveling. He goes to California, goes to Europe, goes through a period of some depression and sort of trying to find himself. And then, as the Vietnam War is heating up, first he goes to the draft board and he tells them that he's taken every drug they can possibly think of to try to get 4F status. And then he decides to go to Toronto, like a lot of other Americans, to try to avoid the draft. He never does get drafted. And he says that technically he wasn't avoiding the draft because he didn't have to go. And fairly quickly he falls into a job managing a head shop. Toronto was kind of, in part because of the influx of all these American hippies, right? It started to boom with like American music and the drug scene. And so he got really involved in that. And he took a lot of drugs. He said he pretty much tried everything that was available. He also admits that he was less about, taking a stand against the war and more interested in chasing hippie women and having a good time, which I think is kind of refreshing. He's not an ideologue at all, And then he meets this Deborah Jean Thompson, and he travels to Europe with her. He said that he preferred to find places where the currency went very far and where they were, sort of coming out of fascism, so that he could observe that sort of stuff going on. He already started to have some theories about science fiction and fascism too, that are in some ways reminiscent of Michael Moorcock, and his notion about a lot of science fiction was really quite regressive in many ways. And eventually he marries Deborah and moves to Vancouver. He writes while she's teaching, and they have a child. And then another kind of funny thing happens. He realizes that he can make more money getting financial aid as a student than he would working, and he doesn't have to put in a lot of work to do so. So he enrolls at University of British Columbia in order to get financial aid. And he starts doing an English degree, and he says, well, this is really good for me because it exposed me to a lot of other literature. And he took a class on sci-fi, and then he becomes interested in sci-fi again and starts writing stuff. And then he becomes aware of punk. And he gets really into the music scene, and he starts spending a lot of time just expanding his record collection. I mean, we're old enough to remember back when people did have record collections. You're a bit younger than that, but CDs, you had those, right? And it was a big thing to you know, you got to hear this album, and then you would take it out very gingerly because you don't want to scratch it and all that sort of.
I still have a lot of those records.
Yeah. We do too. We actually have to sell them because we're never going to play them. You know?
Turntables are back.
Oh, I know. Yeah, yeah. And we total digression. We thought about digitizing them. Because you can get, you know, a card.
I have a
digitizer
digitizer at home.
Yeah, but it's finding the time to actually do that. And I don't know that we'd actually listen to much of that stuff again. And probably a good portion of them are scratched up, you know. So I think you can get a lot of it online now. Now, what ends up happening is he works a couple different jobs for about 3 years, and he doesn't write much. And then he meets this punk musician, author John Shirley, at a sci-fi convention. And Shirley finds out that Gibson has already written a few stories, and he's like, show me the stories. And then he sees them, and he's like, these are good, you need to publish these. And Gibson hadn't really tried to do that prior to that. And so he starts writing again, and he takes this very first thing that's published is Fragments of a Hologram Rose, which he had written as a graduate student, or as an undergraduate student in his sci-fi class. And then he publishes Johnny Mnemonic, which gets turned into a movie later on, with, if I remember right, Keanu Reeves in it. He also meets these two other guys, Bruce Sterling and Louis Shiner, through Shirley, and he starts selling stories to Omni and to Universe 11. Omni was kind of a big thing in the 80s as far as sci-fi magazines went. It was where, like, you know, a lot of the new cool stuff was coming out. They always had really, you know, for the 80s, cool covers, and so, you know, that was kind of a big thing. Not long after that, in '82, he actually appears on a panel at ArmadilloCon down in Texas called Behind the Mirror Shades, a Look at Punk Sci-Fi, and he gets paired up with all these guys. And they're the ones who essentially come up with the term and the beginning of the movement of cyberpunk. So Terry Carr, who he also gets introduced to, is somebody who's you know, sort of an acquisitions editor, I think, commissions Neuromancer for Ace Science Fiction. And now this is a bigger deal, right? Because he hasn't written a novel before that. And he's written short stories, and the short stories have done okay. And he's brutally honest. There's a great passage where he's talking about Neuromancer. And one of the things he says is, Neuromancer is fueled by my terrible fear of losing the reader's attention. Once it hit me that I had to come up with something to have a hook on every page, I looked at the stories I'd written up to that point and tried to figure out what had worked for me before. I had Molly, the character with the razor fingers, in Johnny Mnemonic. I had an environment in Burning Chrome where he had already sort of laid out some of the key features of his world. So I decided I'd try to put these things together. But during the writing of the book, I had the conviction I was going to be permanently shamed when it appeared. And it got even worse when Blade Runner came out in '82, because he was like, oh crap, everyone's going to think that I'm copying Blade Runner because of the sort of neo-noir aspect. So he said, even when I finished it, I had no perspective on what I had done. I still don't, for that matter. I always feel like, this is a beautiful metaphor, I feel like one of the guys inside those incredible dragons you see snaking through the crowds in Chinatown. Sure, the dragon is very brightly colored, but from the inside, you know the whole thing is pretty flimsy. Just a bunch of old newspapers and paper mache and balsa struts. So he's got kind of imposter syndrome, right? He said, I knew I was so inexperienced, I would need a traditional plot armature that had proven its potential for narrative traction. I had these different things I wanted to use, but since I didn't have a preset notion of where I was going, the plot had to be something I already felt comfortable with. The first 2/3 was written a dozen times, a lot of stylistic changes. Once I had the feel of the world, but also a lot of monkeying around to make the plot seem vaguely plausible. Isn't this so wonderful? And he's saying this in '86, after he's become very successful, right? I had to cover up some of the shabbier coincidences, for example. Also, I never had a very clear idea of what was going to happen in the end, except that the gangsters had to score big. So this is almost comedic, right? It reminds me, last year we did A.E. Van Vogt. And A.E. Van Vogt, great classic science fiction writer, had The World of Null A. A lot of people complained about that and said the storyline is not really coherent. And it's incoherent in the same way that like Joseph Heller's Catch-22 is not actually coherent if you map out all the things. It works, right? But it's kind of a mess to try to map out what's going on with Gilbert Gosign and all that in The World of Null A. He's saying something similar about his own work. And he's doing, in effect, what Van Vogt had coined as, I'm trying to remember the name of it, it's not a patch-up. The idea is you've got some stuff already...
When you knit the short stories together into a novel.
And you've got some material, right? And then you just kind of expand it a bit. There is a technical name for it. Not paste up.
No, it's a something up.
Yeah.
Stitch up.
And so I think that's what he's saying he was doing with Neuromancer. So it's really quite amazing that it turned out to be as good as it did. There must have been some talent and some things fermenting there in his mind, right? So Neuromancer comes out, and now notice, Neuromancer, it wins a sort of a trifecta of awards. Hugo, Nebula, and Philip K. Dick Award. Like the year right after it's come out. People are responding to it. It didn't get much press. And he points out later on the New York Times didn't take any notice of it for 10 years. And then notice what happens after that. Count Zero comes out 2 years later. Mona Lisa Overdrive comes out. And only then does he start using a word processor. All this time he's been typing. And he tells us that he doesn't actually know that much about computers. We'll look at a bit of that. And then, he continues on, and he's not a very prolific writer. I mean, he does write a lot of interesting essays here and there, but he's not somebody who's like driven to churn stuff out, either for commercial purposes like Philip K. Dick, really had to keep the stuff coming to like stay afloat financially. Or some people, I think, are much more prolific just because there's so much going. There's other authors. One of the things that I always thought was very funny about Norman Mailer, somebody called him a literary imperialist and said that, any genre you could come up with, Norman Mailer would try to stake a flag there. And so he was constantly, writing, but it was like this kind of ego-driven thing. You get the idea that with Gibson, that really wasn't the case. As a matter of fact, he's writing, and he's like, I don't know why people think this stuff is any good. And then later, he actually leaves the cyberpunk genre, and he starts writing more realistic novels, trying to, I suppose, sort of like, again, he says there's no influence from Philip K. Dick, but there's some parallels there. Dick had his, realistic novels that he wrote, which are quite good and are different from the sci-fi things. I think part of the thing is Gibson is able to get a lot more traction than he does. He also contributes on artworks and installations and different things here and there. He doesn't do an awful lot with adopting new technology. He actually says, I'm not an early adopter. I like to wait until things are completely settled and then I get into them. Like he starts writing a blog. Notice, when does he start? 2003. And he stops. He starts writing and he's like, this is kind of distracting me from getting my book project done. And he cuts it off. He's still, kicking, and he wrote a book recently, The Peripheral, which I haven't read. He also recently got some honorary doctorates. He must have given some commencement speeches or something like that, because that's usually when they do that. From Simon Fraser University and Coastal Carolina University. I think it's kind of cool, because I've been to Coastal Carolina, which is a small, state university. I think it's cool that they brought him in to talk about that. So before we go into some of the philosophical themes, there was a couple other things that I wanted to hit on. The other one is this on the second page from the Cyberpunk project interview as well. This is where he talks a bit more about his approach to technology, and he says, "I'm looking for images that supply a certain atmosphere. Right now, science and technology seem to be very useful sources, but I'm more interested in the language of computers than I am in the technicalities. On the most basic level, computers in my books are simply a metaphor for human memory. I'm interested in the hows and whys of memory, the ways it defines who and what we are, in how easily memory is subject to revision. When I was writing Neuromancer, it was wonderful to be able to tie a lot of these into the computer metaphor. When I arrived at the cyberspace concept while I was writing Burning Chrome, I could see right away it was resonant in a lot of ways. By the time I was writing Neuromancer, I recognized that cyberspace allowed for a lot of moves because characters could be sucked into apparent realities, which means you can place them in any sort of setting or against any kind of backdrop. In some ways, I tried to downplay that because if I overdid it, I'd have an open-ended plot premise. That can be dangerous because you don't have to justify what's happening in terms of the logic of character or plot. In Count Zero, the second main novel, I wanted to slow things down a bit and learn how to do characterization." So he's saying, I didn't quite understand characterization. I was trying to learn it on the fly, right? I was aware that Neuromancer was going to seem like a roller coaster ride to most readers. You've got lots of excitement, but maybe not much understanding of where you've been or why you were heading there in the first place. I enjoyed being able to present someone like Viereck in Count Zero, who apparently lives in any number of realities. He's got the city of Barcelona if he wants it, even though he's just a pile of cells in a vial somewhere. My feelings about technology are totally ambivalent, which seems to me the only way to relate to what's happening today. When I write about technology, I write about how it has already affected my lives. I don't extrapolate in the way I was told a sci-fi writer should. So he's got a very different project. He's, we look at him as like, oh, he's a pioneer. And it's interesting because in interview after interview, I didn't really put this in there, people talk about him as the man who predicted the future and all that. And he's like, I didn't predict it at all. I just happened to get lucky. I made something up that resembles, some of what we do. There's a lot of things I didn't predict, but you forget about that because of confirmation bias, And he's really quite humble about that, rather than thinking that he was a prophet. And that's actually where I don't know if either of you have read Future Shock. So this is a very big book, and you can see it in used bookstores still everywhere, usually in paperback form. Future Shock by Alan Toffler. It came out in, I think, the 70s, maybe?
Yeah.
And it was an interesting book.
I have read that one. Yeah, I have read that one.
Yeah, the basic premise is that because of technology, he was one of the first people to say, look, things are really speeding up to where in the past we could sort of keep track of the difference between the then and the now, and now it's getting too quick. So we're already we're living in the future and don't realize it. And it's not like the Jetsons' future or something like that. It's something that is baffling us and it's causing us anxiety. And how are we going to learn to live with it? And so he says, this is in a Book Expo luncheon talk. He says, Toffler warned us about future shock, but is this that we're living in future fatigue? For the past decade or so, the only critics of science fiction I pay any attention to have been slyly declaring the future is over. I wouldn't blame anyone for assuming this is akin to the declaration that history was over and just as silly, but they're talking about the capital F future, which in my lifetime has been a cult, if not a religion. People my age are products of the culture of the capital F future. The younger you are, the less you are a product of that. If you're 15 or so today, so this is back in 2010, I suspect that you inhabit a sort of endless digital now, a state of atemporality enabled by our increasingly efficient communal prosthetic memory. I also suspect you don't know it, because as anthropologists tell us, one cannot know one's own culture. The future capital F, whether it be crystalline city on the hill or radioactive post-nuclear wasteland, is gone. Ahead of us, there's merely more stuff. Things going on as usual but continual change. So that, for example, this iPhone, right? I have an iPhone 5, and it's woefully out of date because now we're up to iPhone 7, and iPhone just came out with X or whatever that's supposed to be.
10. Yeah,
well, did they jump past 8 and 9? Because
it went straight to 10.
I guess, but everything on this is continually being updated. Mm-hmm. And in the past, we would have looked at that as, that's ridiculous. Why not build it right to begin with? And we're now in a new sort of design paradigm where you just kind of throw crap together, and it's slightly better than what you had before, and we'll kind of figure it out on the way. We've got massive security, liabilities built into these things that even the coders don't know how where all the problems with the code lie, and somehow things just keep on going. And there's minor catastrophes here and there, and yet things manage to keep on going. That's what he's talking about here. And he says, don't mistake me for one of those after the deluge people. I've always found those moments appalling, and most particularly when uttered by aging futurists, who of all people should know better. This newfound state of no future is, in my opinion, a very good thing. It demonstrates a kind of maturity, an understanding that every future is someone's past, every present someone else's future. On arriving in the capital F future, we discover it invariably to be the lowercase now. So that's a very interesting way to look at time and history and technological transformation. I think and this is one of the themes I wanted to talk about, there's a lot of people who get really, really worked up about, the future is going to be so amazing, when we have our jet cars, and, we can transport from place to place, and all of us have, these beautiful, clean living spaces, and computers can just, teach us everything we need to know. And if you think about, the predictions that were made about, what life was going to be like now, looking back at old movies and things, we're nowhere near that. I mean, we've got amazing things that none of them really thought about, the iPhone and the raw power that it's got and how it connects us with everybody. And now we're close to the Internet of Things, right? Which could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing, because Philip Dick has an Internet of Things where they all charge you money to your door won't let you out unless you give it a nickel. There was a great article that came out recently about somebody summed it up as the Internet of Fascist Things, where they're going to be gathering information on you all the time and networking, and maybe we don't want Google to have all that power. But we're inhabiting that time, and we don't have any of the stuff that was supposed to be going on. Our jobs are just pushing a button, like in the Jetsons, or we're not. I mean, we have people who do live on pills and things, but we're not doing that sort of thing. We're living a life that's very similar in many respects to how it's been going on for a long time. We just changed things here and there. So let's talk about then. We'll get back to that theme a bit later. But let's talk about the setting and the world that he's creating. It's partly a virtual world, right? He coins the cyberspace idea. Turns out to be very different than what we now know to be cyberspace. But it's a great imagination on his part. And then there's the world that everybody else is living in, the real world. And that's kind of for the most part, kind of a run-down, crappy world. Although we've managed to explore space, we've got topside, where people can live up in space, in orbitals, and some areas have become very toxic. The sprawl is this thing that in our time we have the Boston to Washington corridor, where it's just city all the way down from Boston through New York and New Jersey, and I guess probably Connecticut too, right? Mm-hmm. And all the way down into Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. In this, it extends all the way to Atlanta, so that's built out further. Big parts of New Jersey are toxic wastelands where you've got to check your food to make, and you can't drink the water. unless it's filtered. Various areas in the world are under the control of governments, and other areas are much less under the control of governments and more under the control of companies. So it's talked about as kind of a neo-noir universe. It's clearly a stratified society where most people don't have a lot of resources and have very little power, not a lot of prospects for moving up, but plenty of for moving down. But there's certain compensations, right? So they can enjoy SimStim, they can patch into other people's lives instead of watching TV. They can just experience what the actress or actor does. So you can do that all day long. There's all sorts of interesting drugs that people can take, and he coins different names for them. Gibson knew a lot about drugs, so he had a lot to work with. What else? I mean, there's all the other kinds of things that people like to do, ranging from fighting to stealing things to just people watching, going to department stores. All of that's there. And it's a world where there doesn't seem to be any sort of overarching project that makes sense of it all. When for a while we had the Cold War, right? And we could make sense of our lives in terms of the Cold War. And then now we have, for at least for some people, the war on terror, or sometimes the culture wars provide people with meaning. There's other projects that people can buy into. You get the idea there's nothing like that in Gibson's world. There's a lot of local projects. There's a lot of sort of high-powered, not agencies, but organizations or sometimes even people who have a particular thing that they want to achieve. And governments do exist, but the governments don't seem to have all that much control over things anymore. So there's nothing to sort of give, you could say, absolute meaning to things. And then, you've got the whole virtual world. And some of his characters are these cowboys who, log in and they try to steal things from banks, and there's all this discussion of ICE, these countermeasures, that are generated by artificial intelligences, and you got to figure out how to break through them. And so it provides kind of an interesting backdrop. One of the things that Gibson is really successful with is never telling you that much about the world. Mm-hmm. He does it through he doesn't give you any sort of, well, here's how this developed. He has the characters.
Not a descriptive narrative.
Yeah. It's mostly through dialogue, I think, which is, smart. You get us hooked into it, and you only have to give enough to make sense of the situation, right?
Yeah.
And somehow we identify with it. I mean, what did you guys, when you were reading this stuff, did you think that you needed more in order for the story to make sense, or for it to be vivid?
Kind of worked as it was. Sometimes I even thought he had too much description, which was...
When? Because I actually had that about certain things.
I think it was towards the climax. There's just more... Isn't he seeing through Molly's eyes? Everything is intensely visual because that's the only input he has. And there's actually so much visual detail that I had no clue what to focus on and kind of zoned out. Which might also be possible because he never had an idea what he was building towards there.
Yeah.
But at that point, because it's famous for its imagery, it opens with the static comparison for the sky and everything. That was effective. But I
found that there were places where he would do a list, and it was visual stuff, and he'd be like, here's what what was being seen, and it would just be a jumble of stuff, and you were like, I don't know what the hell this is supposed to be, but I don't care about this list. Make something happen, It almost seemed, I think maybe that's part of it, maybe that makes it a little dated. Because I think that was kind of a technique that was used. quite a few authors in like the 60s, 70s, 80s. Moorcock was kind of bad for that sometimes too. I don't know, what did you find?
It's been a long time since I read these. It's been a very long time. But it occurs to me as you're talking about if he's doing it through the eyes of the character,
Yeah.
and he's making lists, maybe it conveys something about the state of the mind of the person who's listening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that they just can't focus on it.
That they're not able to focus, or they're jumping from here to there. Or,
Yeah.
it says something about what they're focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing too. So he typically likes to work by having a couple different narrative lines going with characters, and then they get brought together more or less in some way by the end, right? But they're each their own coherent narrative. They could be split apart, and no single one of them really dominates. Except maybe, I guess you could say, Case's narrative in Neuromancer does. But Molly's equal. She's pretty important too, right? So yeah, it's an interesting feature. He does a really good job in being pretty minimalist, but still getting a world there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it leaves a lot of open possibility. I mean, one of the cool things about this is it spun off like a whole secondary literature, cyberpunk stuff, and then like a role-playing game, I don't know. I never actually played it. We created characters for it, but then nobody ever really got around to doing it. But that was the case with lots of role-playing games. And it spawned movies too. So in some respects, it was very successful. It's almost like a virus,
Well, at this time, I wasn't reading a lot of science fiction at this time because I was in my career.
Yeah.
And I didn't have the time to read a lot of science fiction around this time.
I didn't read it until about 7 years ago, and I read it because Andy had it on her bookshelf, and I was like, I heard a lot of people talk about how great this book is. Maybe I should read it. So I picked it up, and I was like, well, this is pretty good stuff,
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't read the other ones until I for getting ready for this, and I enjoyed them. I think they stand up. So let's talk about some of these key philosophical themes. I think the one that, of course, the big elephant in the room is cyberspace, right? He coins the idea. He describes what it's like without having any experience whatsoever of what was going on with computers. Pretty remarkable. He talks about it as a collective hallucination. That's one of the things that characters keep saying over and over again. So I think he got that right about what was going on with the net. Because if you think about how much we're in a world that is real, but is also like infused with all these virtual elements.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, think about what the iPhone does for us, right? I mean, you're like looking something up right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which you're able to do. I don't have to wear a watch because I know what time it is, and I have a thing that tells me where I have to go on the map and my email, and I can do all sorts of other things with it.
We were just able to track Irma.
Oh yeah. And if you had Facebook, you could check in and say that you were safe.
Yeah.
Well, and then we were checking in with family that's down there.
Yeah.
To see what's going on.
So it's pretty amazing what the connectivity of the net has provided. And notice we don't jack in the way that his characters do.
Yeah, it's a lot more lightweight. I was actually texting my sister to see if she had opinions because she loves Neuromancer.
See, a great example of something like real and virtual at the same time, Yeah, I mean, he pictures it sort of like it's this thing that totally consumes us, like what we call virtual reality, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess, there's advances in that. Probably, I'm willing to bet that most of the advances are going to be caused through either the gaming industry or the porn industry, because it seems like porn managed to drive a lot of our industry things, from cameras to website design to all those sorts of things, but also gaming, is going to be really big. And then it'll have all sorts of commercial applications, it's like being able to, I mean, now we have the drone operators, right, who are piloting these drones, and they're not completely in a virtual reality experience, but it's pretty close.
Yeah. There's augmented reality like Pokemon Go.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just heard,
another great example.
I just heard a commentary just the other day about augmented reality.
Yeah.
Where you don't really need a phone, but not a specialized equipment. You're not fully submerged.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, there's a lot of speculation that these, are going to get replaced ultimately by smart glasses. In part because then we don't have to carry these, and it can be more just part of how we exist and how we look around. I don't like that idea myself. I prefer having something external.
It's relying on a lot out of your eye muscles, I think.
Yeah.
If you're going to be staring that way.
Well, I think.
Yeah, and actually, you're probably going to have to learn to do a lot of things with your eyes. I mean, how do you click? Do you bulge them out a bit or
blink?
Oh yeah.
Blinks.
You get an eyelash in there and it's all over.
Yeah.
Especially you're doing your finances or something. Suddenly everything's screwed up.
It's gonna be really hard to enter a PIN. Well, actually, iris scan, I guess. That's pretty foolproof.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, probably be iris scan.
Yeah, but so what he's talking about is cyberspace is something quite different. I mean, we do see a lot of the things that he's talking about, like hacking and trying to break into people's data going on, and countermeasures for that happening as well. But it's not something that we visualize the way he was writing about.
Well, right now we're dealing with political implications that
Yeah.
the authors, when these stories were being written, didn't even think about. In many cases, they never envisioned that kind of hacking.
Well, I mean, hacking of voting machines?
No, well, just what was discussed the other day about Facebook. People creating identities on Facebook.
Yeah, true.
And
well, and Twitter too.
Twitter and creating political movements, political protests and things.
Yeah, whole blocks of people, so it looks like there's really an organized or at least coherent group that feel this way, right?
Well, it was one particular Facebook page was there. It was no group. It was a hacker who set it up as if it was a group, and then spurred people to do protests against Muslims and Hispanics, and he got followers. This was a Russian bot.
Okay.
It was a Russian hacker, and they got all these people to follow the Facebook page.
Yeah. And
then they started proposing, well, why don't you go protest this? Why don't we all go protest this? And got people
to actually show
up.
In real life.
In real life.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah. I'm getting, interestingly, on Twitter, twice a week now on average, I'll get a comment, and it'll be from what is ultimately some porn site on Twitter, and it'll be usually it's about a video of mine, and it'll be great or cool. Have you been getting those too?
I'm not on Twitter, but Tumblr has a major porn bot problem, and there's this constant battle of, because the administration doesn't do anything about it. The users, we kind of find ways to self-moderate and block.
Yeah, I block them when I find out.
And they get better and better at imitating human beings.
Yeah.
So they'll have usernames that look like a name a human being would actually choose as their username.
And they comment on all sorts of stuff.
Yes, in kind of a non sequitur way.
Yeah, but they're commenting on things that you wouldn't think a porn bot would care about.
Yes, that's also the weird thing.
So, other philosophy people.
I don't have either Twitter or Tumblr.
Yeah.
But you see it on Facebook, and I see it on email. having better and better ways of figuring out what will cause you to click.
Yeah, that's true.
The clickbait.
Yeah. Things are getting more and more sophisticated in the internet.
Well, because they see your patterns, and on Facebook, all of a sudden, I'm getting these sites.
So that's
you look at one thing,
yes.
one thing one time, and I'm getting all these sites coming in that I didn't like. I've never clicked like on.
I'm getting, interestingly, when it used to be like if I researched something, it would start all the ads for it would start.
Oh yeah.
Now when Andy researches something, somehow they know that we're connected, and stuff that she's researching, very specific stuff, comes up as ads on like my Google or my LinkedIn.
Wow.
Really persistent. So that's a good transition to talking about AI.
Even Google Plus, which is not all that sophisticated.
Yeah.
My husband was just saying, we were having dinner, and he said, Google just sent me an email asking me to review such and such a restaurant.
Yeah.
Because it knew I was there.
It's funny because I've made fun of Twitter because Twitter does targeted ads.
Yep.
And they're usually for things that I would never in my life buy. And sometimes I'm like, this is so stupid. And so I'll kind of troll them a bit and say, really funny that they put this because I think this is a crap ad and here's why and stuff like that. I try to be a bit more witty about it. But it's refreshing that Twitter just hasn't really gotten it yet. Whereas like Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, they're on top of that. They know you inside and out. So this is a good transition to talking about another key theme of this, which is the role of the AIs, right? Because what we're talking about there is it's AI, but it's not AI in the way that we used to talk about it, where for a long time AI was it was all about, can we get things to pass the Turing test? Can we fool people into thinking that an AI is a human in another guise? And one of the very early programs for that was this. I started looking at it when I was a kid back in the early '80s. It was called Eliza, and it was written in BASIC. It was kind of a long program. But the reason it was long is because it had a number of different catchphrases built into it. And what it did is it took the input of what you were saying, and it was supposed to mimic a psychiatrist who'd be talking to you.
Oh, I remember that.
And so you would write, I'm feeling depressed today, and then it would, that would be a string, and it would say, I'm concerned that you're feeling depressed today, or what do you mean by I'm feeling depressed today? And we get you to start talking with it, and it only had a certain amount of things that it could say, and so eventually you would figure out it would fail the Turing test. You could figure out that it was what we nowadays call a bot, right, or an AI. Bots are very primitive forms of AI, but the things that you're talking about with these algorithms, very, very sophisticated, right? And Netflix is like that too. Netflix was one of the first programs to really try to do that and make a selling point. The AIs in this are incredibly sophisticated. A lot of them are doing jobs for companies like guarding their data. So they develop, the ice that's protecting it, and it's supposed to be more dense if it's an AI. But the AIs, the entire theme of Neuromancer is about these two AIs, one of which is trying to, Wintermute is trying to manipulate things so as to eventually break free of its confines and merge with the other one, who is Neuromancer, who doesn't really want to merge with anybody, because Neuromancer has a personality, Wintermute just adopts personalities. But they're manipulating all these things behind the scene. And then, in the other novels, these Haitian, voodoo spirits or gods or whatever you want to put them are really AIs within the net, ghosts within the matrix. And there's some hint that maybe they're the result of Wintermute and Neuromancers fusing together and escaping the confines. And it's interesting because if you think about other AI scenarios, what is it that it's a big topic right now. What are we really afraid of happening? There are these Turing police in it, right? And the Turing police are there specifically to make sure that no AI is able to augment itself. Because once you let a AI system make itself better, there's no stopping it. And what are our fears? Well, in the Terminator, we have, Skynet. Skynet becomes self-aware, realizes that human beings might shut it down, starts shutting down human beings. The AIs that we have, they could start thinking that we're inefficiencies in the system. Nothing like that happens with these AIs.
Well, in the Enderverse, when we talked about the Ender series by...
what was the name of... It was a Jane?
Jane.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's Jane. Jane is an AI who becomes self-aware.
Yeah.
And augments herself.
Across all the Ansible networks.
Across the whole Ansible network.
Yeah.
And then you get into the debate about, do we have now an entity?
Yeah, and is it
Can we
share
share?
In that one too? Is it? Should we consider it to be human, or
is it human,
or is it too alien from us to be able to say what it's doing?
Is it has enough of a personality, enough of a self-awareness that we can't shut it down?
Oh, because of ethical constraints.
Because that would be murder.
Interestingly, in this, the Turing police, they're ready to shut down any AI, because it seems like the AIs are self-aware, right? But as soon as they're going to change themselves in any way, you got to immediately crack down on that, because there's no way of telling what they'll do. And it turns out Wintermute is interested primarily in just getting out of its confines and doing something different. The other AIs, that are mentioned do guidance of people, and they don't really do anything bad, other than they do cause some accidents and things like that to advance the characters that they're interested in. There is that issue of, well, how do you understand them? How do we relate to them? And now, Gibson seems to think that computers are less about the computer entity itself and more about how we humans relate ourselves to them, how we understand ourselves through them. And one interesting way of thinking about AI that really fits in with the algorithms and stuff like that is that Turing tests were never really the way to go about things. It's not about creating something that imitates the human and can pass as a human and can thereby, at a certain point become self-aware. That's all cool, but what's really important in thinking about AI is what AI does in how I relate to you, or you relate to her. It's an interface more than an entity by itself. And if you think about it that way, then we don't have to have AI being something like an imitation of a human. If, like we talked about, we didn't email, right? Well, if we had a great AI assistant to do all that stuff, then the emails would have gone out on time, right? Simple things like that.
But even that we're not to the point yet where that's all that successful, because I just had it happen with Amazon. I just ordered under their new system for the drop boxes.
Okay.
I just put my first order in under Amazon Dropbox.
Yeah.
And it was delivered this morning, to the Dropbox. And the way the system is supposed to work, and it's not controlled by humans, it's programmed.
Where did it go?
Well, it went. It was fine.
Okay.
But they're supposed to send out an email or a text
to tell you
it's there, and here's your code number to access it. Didn't happen.
So you just got it sitting there.
It's sitting there.
Doing nothing.
I happen to be tracking it because it's the first time I've ever done this.
Yeah.
So I was tracking delivery and realized it had been delivered this morning.
Yeah.
And I had not received a message. And I managed to get hold of Amazon, and they couldn't explain why. Because the computer it should have no human intervention.
Yeah.
The computer is just supposed to do it.
Well, this is a great example of, something like Gibson and I think a lot of other authors like Philip K. Dick are great at bringing out, is exactly that sort of thing where, in theory, things are supposed to work this way. Mm-hmm. And in practice, things are constantly getting gummed up, and people have to intervene. Yeah. And it's always like patchwork stuff, and nobody quite knows what's going on. Now in this, of course, people are sort of exploiting that, right? They're using like gaps to break into things and steal information and all that. But in our own life, it's a bit more comic than.
Well, I'm thinking we're talking about AI that can, although not mimicking humans, but can behave in that way.
Well,
and I'm thinking of all the sites that I go to that one of the security questions is, "I'm not a robot."
Yeah, that's true.
And if it's a sophisticated AI, would be able to click that. Be able to click that.
The other thing to think about too is, so if AIs are supposed to pass as humans, most humans, when it comes to most activities, are pretty dumb, mm-hmm. right? So you could like imagine like if I had to somehow handle what Amazon shipping is doing. I sure as hell couldn't do it. I'm sure I'd have things in the wrong spots and be reporting things. Oh, your package is there and it's not there and stuff like that. We want, and in some respect, we want AI to be very, very human, but we want it to be like certain humans, right? Not the ones that are pains in the rear, not the ones who screw things up, not the ones who need a day off. All these sorts of things, and so we want something that's kind of contradictory, probably, and if the AIs are smart, they'll figure it out and warehouse us.
I'm sitting here thinking about Asimov's robot series.
Oh,
when we talk about AI, mm-hmm. because
there's nothing like that in these. That's interesting.
When he gets further along in the books, you have a robot who has no limits.
Yeah.
And has developed himself to the point where he can be human, pretty much.
Well, that's where the robot series and the later part of the Foundation series connect up, too.
Yeah, that's where they can come together.
Yeah. Let me bring us to a different theme, which is that of power and like the people who. I mentioned projects, right? Things that give mm-hmm. meaning to people's lives. And a lot of the projects in this are, hey, let's rob somebody, let's get over in some way, let's jack in and break through the ice and get the information from here and sell it to this person. But there are some big organizations, and there are still some nation states, China is mentioned, Russia, the United States, Brazil. These things are still doing things. They don't control that much. The corporations seem to have a lot of power. There's also the mobs. The British mob is mentioned. The Yakuza is part of things. And then there's certain entities that seem to be, they have kind of niches cut out for them. One would be SenseNet, right? The ones who do all the SimStim stuff. And they play a big role in this. But then you've got these other two things, the Tessier Ashpool family and this guy Virek. And there's even some theorization about this in Count Zero. There's an academic who's writing a dissertation on a great way to work things in. It's a very smart move there on Gibson's part. And they talk about how what's going on with people who have so much power. Can they keep it together? Can they focus on tasks, or does that power just turn into like an endless cycle of playing around? Which seems to be what happens with the Tessier Ashpool family. It's described. Their space place is described as just kind of a hodgepodge of all sorts of things put together. Very expensive things, but doesn't really make sense. They start cloning their kids and then thawing them out, and sometimes they do bad stuff to them. Sometimes the kids get to do whatever they want. The AIs are created. The ones that are important in Neuromancer are created by the Tessier Ashpool family as well. And they have some things built in. This Virek guy is incredibly wealthy, but he's actually living. His body is just totally decrepit, and he's in a bunch of what would you call it, like he's in a bunch of tubes and beds, and he's being kept alive, but it's the life that he lives is primarily through the net, and it's facilitated by all the money that he has, and clearly he wants immortality, and it seems like the Tesserae Ashpoles also want immortality, but just go nuts. It's unclear whether that's what the Zenbatsus are about. They train up all these corporate things, and Gibson uses metaphors for them of like insects, like bees or wasps. They just keep reproducing over and over again, training up new generations. Doesn't seem like a very meaningful life, you know? So the question is, where do you get meaning? Does it have to be in struggle? I think this is kind of a good open question, particularly as we're like approaching a time where we might have to, if we don't want society to completely collapse, we might have to like give everybody a universal basic income. What's going to keep people from what's going to keep the regular people from going nuts? And then what's going to keep the rich and the powerful from equally going nuts when there's no new things to do? Which is, I don't know, maybe the rich can prey on the poor. That can give them some meaning for a while, but that doesn't last very long. Cruelty gets pretty boring, it seems, for a lot of people. It's very unclear where we're headed. And I think his novels, the characters that we have, they've always got some sort of drive, right? Because they have a mission. When they're in downtime, a lot of them have no idea what the hell to do. So they get in trouble and do dumb stuff. And,
well, we see that today with military.
Yeah.
And with, we were talking about police earlier, with people who are in first responder type positions. When they're responding, when they're in the field, they have a purpose.
Yeah.
They know exactly what they're doing. You take them out of that, and they have difficulty coping.
Yeah.
Many of them, not all, but many, have real difficulty coping with the world that's different from when they're in the field.
Yeah.
Because when they're in the field, the purpose is very clear. It's very simple. It's very clear.
That happens even with managers. I had a guy who was a client who was great when things were in crisis mode. And then when things got routine and he started feeling a bit bored, he found himself without drive, and he would start to let things slide, and then, of course, panic.
To create a crisis.
Well, that's what I suggested to him. I mean, you don't have to be Freud to figure that one out, right? But he was genuinely troubled by it, and I suggested maybe you need to learn how to manage routine life. I guess a crisis lets you rise to it, right? And so there's a lot to be thought about with that. I mean, Case has all these like poison sacs in his head that are going to go off if he doesn't get things right. Molly, what is her motivation?
Is she trying to get memories back?
I think so. I think that sounds right. Armitage is just a complete, screwed up mess. He's not even a real person anyway. There's other characters who are just kind of, screwed up, and what their motivations is, like Rivera. And then, you can say the same thing for each of these other characters as well.
A lot of writers have looked at, if you advance to a certain point, how do we keep purpose in life?
Yeah.
And I don't know that anybody's come up with the answer yet. Not entirely.
Yeah, Iain M. Banks keeps trying.
That's true. Yeah. That's a big issue for the. What was the name of
culture.
that? The culture. Yeah. And
they kind of just made up their own projects.
Yeah, but you notice the ones that were more interesting were the ones who became part of what was it called? Special services.
Special services.
Yeah.
Special circumstances.
Special circumstances.
Special circumstances.
Because at least then you get to engage the outside
existential
world.
threat every once in a while.
Yeah. So that's actually a good transition to this whole notion of like losing, sort of overarching narrative or purpose. One of the things that, Gibson talks about the postmodern, right? And we talk today about postmodernism, and that's an idea, strangely enough, that's been around long enough that it's really not postmodern anymore. It's older than us, and it's kind of old hat in many ways. It's kind of funny that nowadays people on the right are like, attacking Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze, as if anybody on the left actually reads them, and does something from them. And they're like, postmodernism is bad. And nobody really knows what postmodernism means. There's a whole bunch of different theories out there. Ultimately, there's something like, well, there's no single meta-narrative that makes sense of everything. But you get beyond that, nobody quite knows what it means. Now, I don't think that Gibson is a postmodernist at all. I think that he's quite happy to be writing essentially modernist literature, right? Neo-noir, cast in a cyberpunk situation. But he is writing about a postmodern condition in which everything is kind of jumbled up together. And one of the cool things that people did say about the postmodern is that the postmodern is sort of the modern continued and continued and continued. If you think about this notion of modern, right? People have been using that word for 200 years now, talking about how the previous generation was antiquated and we got to get rid of their crazy stuff and do the modern thing, right? And look back on all these, things that counted as modern, and we're like, oh, that's so quaint, Now hipsters use that. And are you actually going to use that rotary phone? Think about it. Rotary phones were incredibly modern for a while, and then we had cordless phones, and that was very modern. And now we've got this brick of circuits and stuff like that. Who would possibly have one of those crazy cordless phones that's like this big and some people still have them, but they're kind of curiosities, right? And so the postmodern part of that is that things just keep going on and changing and not always improving necessarily, but certainly developing. Gas stations are a great example.
I think the problem with the term postmodern is it suggests that we're done.
That's true. Yeah.
That modern it's finished.
Yeah,
we're past it.
Yeah,
it's like using the term post-race.
Oh, yeah.
Was it post?
Yeah, post-racial. Yeah.
Post-racial.
Yeah. We solved all of that.
We've solved all those problems.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with the term postmodern. It suggests we've solved all our problems.
Yeah.
We're at the pinnacle.
Or we're just rejecting the modern.
Or we're just rejecting the modern completely.
Yeah, and that was where Gibson talking about like capital F future and then lowercase future. I think that's a really smart way to go about looking at it. The postmodern is sort of like saying, yeah, we are in the future, and it's nothing like what we thought it was going to be. We're still pumping gas into internal combustion engines. They're not hover cars, they're not flying around. They don't fold up like the Jetson thing into your suitcase, and we can't continue that forever. We're going to run out of fossil fuels pretty soon. And we'll find some other crazy thing to continue on with this. And there's probably still going to be gas stations, but who knows what they'll look like. They probably won't take credit cards because we'll have chips or something like that, right? But it'll still be the same kind of stuff going on. And I guess the point is, you're never so postmodern that you leave behind everything and enter into a totally new domain.
The other question becomes, if you do you stop being human?
So that's another thing I wanted to talk about.
When you go past the daily routines, the how we do business, and I've had some...
you might call it our existential condition, right?
Yeah.
Things like having a job and having to worry about rent and...
Well, I have discussions with people who are somewhat older than me periodically about cell phones and cyber...
Oh, yeah.
And the concept of well, it's driving people apart and it's ruining connection. And yet we sit here and you text your sister to find out.
Yep.
And I say, I'm actually in touch with more people than I was when I just had a phone.
Yeah.
If I was reduced to people I talk with either in person or in voice, it'd be a lot
If it was
fewer.
reduced to what I used to communicate with with just a phone, my circle of who I'm in touch with in my family, and not faux friends, but actual human connections has grown. It's actually bigger.
Social media has played an incredibly huge role in that, I think, too.
And it's more personal rather than instead of letters or occasional Christmas cards.